For some, an entire lifetime is spent wrestling, straining, grabbing, pulling, succumbing, engaged close and deep with false identity, worldly pleasure, pain, rejection, money, fear, anxiety, depression, disappointment, selfishness. But in this hour, there is a Jacob generation rising who has come to the end of themselves, weary of the running, realizing wholeheartedly that they were born to wrestle not with the trappings of this world, but with the lover of their soul, not letting go until he changes their walk, gives them a new name, and instills his DNA. You are that generation. You are that people. Identified not by your hobbies, your last name, your physical appearance, your fashion, your career path. No! You are known by the nature of your up-close and personal engagement with him.
I came across this phrase this week from Jeremy Berg. It says, "I've been walking with a spiritual limp for some time now." And that phrase kind of resonated with me. Berg later goes on to say that the telltale sign that someone has brushed up against God's awesome presence is often this: they walk with a spiritual limp. Signs of faith shifting, certainties upheaved, beliefs scattered, doubts spoken, and the ways we relate challenged. And God both silent and loud, yet present in all of it, and us changed. The book of Genesis gives us an introduction to the story of God and humanity, specifically God and the nation of Israel. From the lens of Christianity, this is the story that meanders its way towards the revelation of Jesus by way of introducing us to the many relatives who reveal to us the very best and worst of who humans can be, and the varied ways humanity engages with God and understand God to engage with them. From the first story in Genesis chapter 1, the account intended to quiet the wonderings of how the world began, we see the story unfold of a God who walks with his creation in the garden. Abraham encounters God face to face as he's told he will have a child within a year. And Lot encounters two angels and both saves them and is confronted by them. An angel guides Hagar to water, promising her that she's not forgotten. And Isaac encounters an angel as he is untied from the altar his father has placed him on. And Jacob, his son, first encounters God in a dream and later face to face. Now, I tell you all of these encounters, for although they are spread out over several hundred years, they do help us to see that from the beginning, both men and women knew that God was not simply interested in belief, in submission, or in allegiance, but God was and is interested in the conversation. Interested in conversation with them and with us. This is revolutionary, that the God who sees us and who knows us also wants to be known by us, and both invites and longs for a dialogue, longs for a conversation, a back and forth between the eternal and the mortal. Now, Richard Middleton makes note of this in his book, Abraham's Silence, as noted by Scott McKnight, who references Isaac's near miss at the hand of his father. McKnight writes, Middleton thinks Abraham did not, in fact, pass the test of Genesis 22. He could have protested for his son and his love for his son. He could have interceded. He could have had a more robust faith in God's provision. He thinks he just barely passed the test of God's character. Middleton suggests that just as Abraham had conversed with God to spare his nephew's life and the life of a city, so could he have had conversation about his son Isaac long before the walk up the mountain. Middleton insists that a God who invites conversation should have changed how Abraham viewed God. Indeed, it should change how we view God. And Middleton has a premise that Isaac, his son, learns to fear God because of how Abraham doesn't vouch for him, that Abraham doesn't defend him. Oh, aren't you a sweetheart? What a beautiful moment, this. So he feels that Abraham doesn't vouch for him, defend him, or make any attempt to save him. He just waltzes him up to the mountain and is prepared to make him the sacrifice. This flies in the face of the other times that Abraham is prepared to make him, sorry, I just know that no one's listening to me in this moment. When cuteness comes, pastors should just be silent. And there's a fly. This is just it's a great moment. I can't talk, it's good, it's great. So this flies in the face of all of the other times that Abraham dialogues with God. And if Middleton's ideas are correct, then it is probably a fair assessment that Isaac passes down this idea about God to his sons, Jacob and Esau. That they should follow God from a distance, with their heads cowered and bodies ready to flinch at God's raucous commands and actions. Perhaps it's this moment in Isaac's history that leads him to imagine that there's only enough blessing for one of his sons, and that enmity between brothers is something that is allowed, something that belongs. And so when we meet Jacob, son and a brother, And so when we meet Jacob, a son and a brother, a man who has allowed much of his life to be formed by discontent and deception, as he takes what belongs to another over and over again, even when he takes from his own twin brother, Esau, the cost for his deception is years of estrangement from his family, a nagging fear of his brother, and unfortunate reliance on what can be gleaned from others. And so in Genesis 32, the night before it's time for his past to meet up with his presence, the night before Jacob is destined to be reintroduced to his brother, the one he has betrayed, Jacob finds himself alone and in the dark, face to face with all of himself and face to face with God. Now, in our imagination, this would be God's chance to get him. This would be God's chance to take back from Jacob what he had stolen. In our imagination, this would be the moment that God condemns Jacob and takes him out back and lets him know what's what. Instead, Jacob meets a nameless figure who wrestles with him, who holds him down and is held down, who grasps and thrashes with vested interest, who both receives and delivers one blow after the other, neither able to adequately overcome the other until the nameless one touches or wrenches or strikes his hip, leaving Jacob in pain and disadvantaged. The figure asks, or more likely the figure warns, that daybreak is approaching. But Jacob is unmoved, and he refuses to be outmatched. And so he meets the demand with a demand of his own. And he says, "Bless me." And in this moment, Jacob is given a new name. This is reminiscent of Abraham and Sarah, of Peter, of Mary Magdalene and Paul, that somehow coming face to face with God reveals your calling, reveals your purpose, reveals your actual name. For Jacob, he is to be called Israel, one who struggles with God and man and somehow overcomes. And Jacob, along the way, notes that this strange encounter of the night, long struggle with God, is one that needs to be remembered. And so he renames the place of his wrestling Peniel. I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. Sarah Koenig notes that Jacob's new name, Israel, is defined by the narrator in 32 verse 28 as he struggles with God. But its actual linguistic etymology is better translated as God struggles or God rules. That is, Jacob does not only wrestle with God, but God wrestles with Jacob. And it's costly for Jacob. He is marked and he's wounded by it. This encounter that Jacob has reminds me of all those who went before and had their own encounters with God, and all those who would come after with their own stories of God encounters. And the beautiful realization that God engages with us emerges. The God of the conversation, the God of the interaction, the God who sees us as we are and as we should be, and who meets us face to face, the God who wrestles with Jacob. This encounter is not simply the story of Jacob wrestling with God, but it is also the story of God wrestling with Jacob, taking the blows, taking the thrust to the ground, and taking the humility of not winning. But I also imagine this is God meeting Jacob in a way that Jacob could listen, in a way that Jacob could engage, in a way that Jacob could understand. So the walking in the garden, that was for Adam and Eve. The meeting around the table was for Abraham and Sarah. The angel freeing the captive child, that was for Isaac. And the wrestling on holy ground, that was for Jacob. The walk after eating is for Peter. The voice from heaven on the way to Damascus is for Paul. The freeing of demons is for Mary Magdalene. And all were left with some kind of proverbial spiritual limp. Some way in which what was can no longer contain what is. In other words, an encounter with God, a face-to-face moment with God, must leave us changed. Last week I told the story, and I told it with a lot of hesitancy and caution, about a young woman who eventually died from a disease that is linked with trauma and addiction. Her story was one of wrestling with God, but it was also the story of one who was changed by her ongoing conversation with God. Somewhere in her history, in her story, she caught a glimmer of a God who loved her, a God who saw her, a God who was this faithful backdrop despite the best and the worst of her. And that is what drew her back time and time again into the doors of the church, and time again back to God at these critical moments in her lifetime. Somehow her conversation with God, her engagement with God, her wrestling had left her with this spiritual limp. A God whose presence she just couldn't shake. And while her story is not my own, perhaps that is perhaps that is part of the point. That how I am changed, how God speaks to me, the way that God engages with me, the way that God changes me is not the way that God changes you. The way that God renames me is not the way that God renames you. Perhaps there is something found weaving its way in the story of Jacob that reminds us that while God converses with us all, the language spoken to each of us is uniquely our own. And for some, the conversation looks like literal wrestling, and for others, it's a bright light. But for all, it cannot leave us unchanged. And this is why God wrestles with us as we wrestle with God. This is why the conversation is ongoing, even in the midst of long pauses and when body language is all that we have to read. The conversation, the wrestling, the out of joint hip, all of it is that we would be transformed. For Jacob, the way he walked was forever changed. It was a reminder of the day he conversed with God. And for you, it may be the words we begin to speak about ourselves, or the ways that we change how we speak to or about others. For some, it will be how you relate with the church and understand the role of the church in the world. For others, it's going to be how you do business, no longer just seeing dollars and cents, but now seeing the opportunity to participate in heaven being mirrored on earth. For some, it's how you care for your body. For others, it's how you care for your family. And for some, it will be how you care for your neighbors. And for others, it will be this mix of it all. But the point is this: the conversation with God, the dialogue, the wrestling, the listening, all of it is intended to leave us changed. All of it is intended to leave us transformed so that we can participate in the creating change all around us. We are changed so that we can be agents of change. What is your spiritual limp? For me in this season, mine is acknowledging the breadth of God's love and acceptance, as far exceeding what humans craft or write, what people idealize in sermons, what people can write in doctrines and manuals. And seeing God as both within these things and outside of these things and superseding them, well, it's changed me. And it's made me walk with some kind of a limp. I now view my responsibility as a pastor differently. I view myself and others with far more grace and far more compassion. I can feel the push and the pull of the Spirit as I speak and become more and more passionate about the creation of a more just world. And I can see Jesus meddling with my ideas about how much room there is at the table. Where I once insisted we were full to capacity, now I see space, boundless space for questions, for the outsiders, for the forgotten, for the wounded and the tired, for the powerless, the seeking and the marginalized, which means that I see room for each of us who are present and those who are glaringly absent to make up the beautiful diversity of the church. And on some days, the limp is completely forgotten. I barely remember it's there. I don't even feel it at all. And on other days, I am keenly aware that I walk a little bit differently with tiny shoots of God-given pain that remind me of the ongoing conversation. That's my story, but what is yours? As you deconstruct and reconstruct, as you tear down falsehoods and as you rebuild faith, as you sense the Spirit leading you and shaping you, as old things erode and become useless, foreign tools that must be discarded, and as new tools and systems and ideas that Jesus gives you guide and shape you, what phrases and actions make your heart beat? What causes you to catch your breath? What are the words from God that you must write down and cannot forget? Where are you wrestling? What are you wondering? What pain are you feeling? What is God speaking? All of it is a part of the conversation, even when it is nothing more than a bruised hip, a new limp, a new way of walking that reminds us God is both listening and speaking, and he welcomes the conversation. Ask the worship team to come forward. I'm going to close with this quote. It says, "May we strive to be God wrestlers and pain embracers in a culture of God appeasers and pain avoiders. May pastors and church leaders invite people onto the mat to wrestle with God with the openness, honesty, and courageous vulnerability. Only those who are willing to wrestle with shadows in the night will truly grow in God and find true spiritual freedom on the other side of a polite, dainty, and overly sanitized Christianity. No pain, no gain is just as true in spiritual training as it is in physical training. I want to be a pastor who leads with a limp, and I want to lead a community of people who would rather be uncomfortable in the awesome presence of God than comfortable in our own self-made world where Jesus' meddling presence is kept safely at a distance. Let us follow Jacob's example. Grab onto God, don't let go, and let those all-night battles with God be an indicator that our faith is alive and God is with us in the darkest desert. Let God give us each a new name, a new identity. You are Christian, one who wrestles with God. Thanks for bearing with all of the upsets and the cuteness, which I love. As we go into this week and as we think about the areas in our lives and in our faith and in our journey where God is actively speaking and moving and asking us to take new steps and new directions and to let go of old things and hold on to new things, may we not do those things so much with fear, although it can be scary, but to do those things understanding that those changes allow us to be much more in tune with who God is and where God is leading and where God is moving his church. Rather than feeling that these things are stifling us or stifling the church, let us allow those things to give us our own spiritual limp so that we can walk differently. And as we walk differently, so that we can live lives that are changed, that are transformed by the work of the Spirit in us and around us. That's the beautiful invitation. Have a blessed week.